Hi everyone, it's about 7 p.m, so I think we're going to get started with our book launch. My name's Jasmine, I'm from Carcanet Press. I'm just going to give you a few pointers before I hand over to David and Yvonne. So firstly, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your support. It's mayhem out there, you may know, but we're heading into an autumn where all of the books that were postponed at the start of the year are being published now. So it's going to be a tricky time for indie publishers like Carcanet. So we really appreciate your support and thank you for being here to launch this amazing book with us. So this is David Morley's new collection, Fury. You might know that it's the Poetry Book Society Autumn Choice. And it's also currently shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection. So I'm really looking forward to this reading. I'm just going to tell you what's going to happen this evening. So this event is going to last about an hour. In a second, I'm going to disappear. I'm going to hand over to Yvonne Reddick, who's going to introduce David. You may know Yvonne, she's also a poet. She's got a lovely pamphlet out with Seren, and she also recently published a study on Ted Hughes and eco-poetry that came out in 2017, so check her out if you don't know her work. Yvonne will introduce David before his reading. While he's reading, we're going to show the text on screen, so you should be able to read along. If you do need to see David's face a bit bigger, if you need to lip read or anything like that, then you can double click on his face. But also there's the chat, so if you have any questions, do put that in the chat for us. Also do say hi. We like to hear from you. We like to hear your feedback on the poems and stuff and on the event, because obviously we can't see your faces. So yeah, find the chat for us, say hello. Please also do try and find the Q&A box. After David's reading, Yvonne will come back and she and him will have a little conversation about the new book. But we also want to take some audience questions in that time. So if you could find the Q&A box, that would be great, because we want some questions from you for later on. After that conversation, David's going to close with one final poem, and then that will be all from us tonight. So obviously you've all paid your £2 to be here, and we're really grateful for that. You can get that £2 off the book. I'll put that in the chat for you now. Don't worry if you miss that. There's loads of things going on in the chat, which is great. Look in your inbox. If it doesn't come, just email me. I'm on all the listings as the organiser, so you can get in touch with me easily enough. So I think without further ado, I am going to hand over to Yvonne to introduce David.
Everyone, thanks so much for coming. I thank you very much indeed for coming along. I'm thrilled to be introducing David Morley. Professor David Morley is a poet and ecologist. The recipient of the Ted Hughes Award, his new collection, Fury, is a Poetry Book Society choice and currently shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection. David is also known for his poetry installations within natural landscapes, slow poetry sculptures, and I-cast poetry films. This is a very, very exciting book. I want to share with you a review from the Traveller's Times. In this daring new collection, Morley holds a mirror up to the myriad of irresponsible ways that we as humans influence the natural world and how we treat one another. Threaded with Romanis, as Morley's poems often are, this is a celebration of the Roma tongue as well as the people and places gone by. To read Fury is to tread our pilgrimage along the oldest Proteca. To know these paths is to be compelled to walk them again, to feel the trembling pride for our ethnicity, and to sing once more of home. Welcome, David Morley.
Okay. Hi everybody. Welcome to our home. I believe we have at least 100 people out there. I'm delighted you've all been able to make it here tonight. I'm afraid there's only 6 of you allowed in my house at any one time, but in using this technology, hey, you can all fit in here, right next to this fireplace, while we look at these poems together and hear some. It's a book which I actually really enjoyed writing, which can't be said for all my books. It's a book that I kind of grew into, and it grew on me over about a year, whose title gave itself to me quite quickly, having written a poem in the voice of the Romani boxer Tyson Fury, a poem which I've shared with the man himself, by the way. I'm going to start by reading one of the poems from a sequence called Lye Birds. Lye Birds, a lyre bird is an Australian species of bird living in the rainforest in Victoria, which I've tracked and seen myself. They're very famous for their ability to impersonate not just other birds and other animals, but also the sounds that humans make, sometimes intrusive sounds, such as chainsaws or camera shutters. They're birds which are caught by mimicry. And so somebody who tries to explore language through mimicry and who came to poetry through natural history, particularly through bird watching and ecology. And for myself, somebody who came to poetry through having a stammer, that idea of mimicry I found very attractive as a way of making kind of a vow for myself to another and to those I love. Your vow is a lyre bird's thesaurus of mimicry. Your vow yaffles with the laughter of a kookaburra. Your vow sings the syllables you share with our children. Your vow lullabies a jungle's stories, canopies, and understory. My vow catapults a kingfisher past a kookaburra. My vow scales a frozen waterfall's icicled aviary. My vow strips a eucalypt's paper bark for nests for rainbow lorries. My vow ploughs a ridge walk through a peat bog slog and slurry. Your vow paints Jane Austen's miniatures on 2 inches of ivory. Your vow quickens a bare forest with your footsteps in snow. Your vow spills its watershed through the fells, tarns and freshets and startles snowdrops from the floor of heaven. My vow hushes a fir forest and my footsteps in snow. My vow spies a single star from out the wide night's numbers. You'll notice as I go through these poems that there may be little changes to phrases because some phrases are easier for me to read in performance, and therefore I have a sort of slight stammerer's version as well as the page version. Spoken word as what the Romanis call pagadi jib, which means broken speech. This poem here is an excerpt from a much longer poem. It's simply the opening. The poem is about a magician who's part of a tribe of Romanis. He's lost his ability to do magic through speech, through, in this case, alcoholism. And though it's a sad poem, I think it's also a poem of redemption through language. The Thrown Voice. The story starts with who you are. I strode at night, across the heath to hear a nightjar. It was night which throws her voice inside a bird. I would stand below his song and become cast into creature, into his pearled world. The bird could never be seen. It seemed a soft scar of sound, as if the lone tree's bark sang the night's wound from a lone tree's bough. And yet heath and bird were grown two in the dark. Those wounded voices were thrown into me, as if bird and tree were hornbooks I could finger and trace and sing aloud. I spoke through night, or night through me, and all the creatures of the night sang free. My gypsies gave tongue to campfire stories, but my spell drew speech from the circling heath. I was a magician to them, the magic man to my people. I lost it. I lost my magic when I lost those voices. I cried my eyes out. I have cried my eyes into myself. How can you know what it is like to lose your magic? The next poem is actually a pantoum, a Malayan form of which there's a certain amount of repetition of the lines. The language I use here is Anglo-Romani, but it's contemporary Anglo-Romani. I don't want to give you a lecture about Romani dialects or Romani language, but except to say that the dialects of Romani change according to country, ever so slightly. They change according to time. In my book, The Invisible Kings, I wrote a poem that was set around 1820 in Bulgaria, and I was using specifically Romani dialect from that time and place. This is very specifically contemporary Anglo-Romani. After death, the van and the belongings of a Romani are burnt. They're regarded as marame, which means unclean. And that's what the poem is saying and not saying. In silence, through the word murnamos, in silence, is what the poem is saying and not saying. What the Roma do not say to each other is as important as what we do choose to say, or what we choose to say even here. For example, the Romani Holocaust in the Second World War, the Pajaramos, which means the great devouring, is something which isn't often talked about because it is regarded as marame, or unclean. After the burial of the gypsy matriarch, the Roma are torching her proud Vado in Murnamos. The Yag leaps into the barrow and billows in Murnamos. Pato, Sahlia, Patua, her possessions flare in Murnamos. Heraclo shuffles her banca, palms them out in Murnamos. The Yag leaps into the barrow and billows in Murnamos. Her lurcher is Nashaval from the Campo in Murnamos. Heraclo shuffles her banca, palms them out in Murnamos. The Jukul peers and peers from the whoosh in Murnamos. Her lurcher is Nashaval from the Campo in Murnamos. Para, tower to the Kritza, collapse in Murnamos. The Jucal peers and peers from the Wush and Murnamos. The Roma rake and rake the Scrumar in Murnamos. Power, tower to the Kritzer, collapse in Murnamos. Their Vardos circle the field. They vanish in Murnamos. The Roma rake and rake the Scrumar in Murnamos. What the Roma do not say to each other is buried in Murnamos. Their Vardos circle the field. They vanish in Murnamos. Pato, Satlia, Patra, everything burns in Murnamos. What the Roma do not say to each other is buried in Murnamos. The Roma are torching her Vardo. Everything must burn. Romani Wounds Me is a is a poem that came very quickly. It's written as a dramatic monologue in the voice of a contemporary traveller, but it's all set around where I live and travellers and circumstances I've witnessed myself. It began with a phrase from George Sepphoris, the Greek poet, which he says, "Wherever I travel, Greece wounds me." And Stow in the Wold, Kenilworth, Durham, Horsemond and Appleby are all traditional horse fairs. It's a poem that's very much set in the moment, I think. Wherever I travel, Romani wounds me. As I hoved into the horse fair at Stow on the Wold, between Cotswold chintz shops and a roving road, HGVs hunkered after our wagons on the Foss Way, cursing us with air brakes and grunting gear shifts. At Kenilworth Fair, with its tailbacks to Longbridge roundabout, Vardos bottlenecked behind ponies from Pershore, rocks rammed on verges of all the villages between by neighbourhood watchers, with the policeman's nod. At Durham Fair, I crowbarred the stern stones from the wayside and flattened fat molehills under my 4x4, and snored under the stars of headlights flying across the bypass, and slung the crook of my kettle above an illegal blaze. At Gressenhall, Swaffham and Peterborough, the pubs were barred to me. What do the Gentiles want? These polite people who curses were Romanian or worse than. A copper pulls us over and barks for passports. Mate, I come from Rotherham, laughs one gypsy, though it's foreign country round these parts. And as we sleep, Europe drifts away across the sea. The cling net of England closes. Our caravans are ships with their engines flooded. Our lives are drowning. Strange people, the English. They say this land is ours, but they don't rove beyond their commutes or school runs. Imagine the coppers rocking up at their caravan sites. Meanwhile, England keeps on travelling, always travelling backwards. In my dream, our flotilla of caravans set sail from Dover's chalk shore, as though the little boats at Dunkirk were our own gypsy rados, as though we were machine-gunned by our own Spitfires, and those brothers on the beach were our own strafed kin, which we were, but we were borderless and one. Between the horse fairs of Horsemonden and Appleby, at all the stopping places when I wake, and in every face I see, wherever I travel, Romani wounds me. There are 7 lyre birds in this book, interspersed and singing throughout, and this is number 4. Your vow conducts the anemone's 3-ring circus at Clanfish. Your vow gives the colour's desire to Frida Kahlo. My vow kites in the red drift of migrating monarch butterflies. My vow divines the jangled language of migrating geese. My vow captures the colour Kahlo desired of Diego de Rivera. My vow meshes and rings winged verbs in mist nets. Your vow deciphers the driftwood's pictographs and hieroglyphs. Your vow braids a belt of straw, ivy buds and coral clasps. Your vow releases orioles from their snares and lime traps. Your vow frets a nightingale's dulcimer at dawn. My vow unclasps a coral reef from its bleached atoll and clenches an oak leaf in free fall. My vow is a tawny owl, packing up his piccolo at dawn. My vow plies a goldfinch's blatted palette and easel. When I heard The Calling of Birds, was written in response to Tawfiq Bahani. Tawfiq Bahani has been held in Guantanamo Bay Detention Center since early 2003, despite having never been charged with any crime. In 2010, Tawfiq was officially cleared for release by the Obama administration, and yet he still remains detained. Tawfiq writes poetry in English and Arabic. And one of Tawfiq's poems, which I really admire, closes with a line, when I heard the calling of birds, I remembered your sweet voice when you sang the song, Remember Me This Way. I took this line only as a starting point for a poem in the form of a ghazal. And all the birds that are invoked in this poem occur at Guantanamo Naval Base, which paradoxically is a haven for wildlife. When I heard the calling of birds, I remembered your sweet voice when you sang, "Remember me this way." When you folded my heart in your wing to remember me this way. When emerald hummingbirds flashed through the chain link fence, I remembered them that day. When a palm swift slipped from her nest in the dark camp echo, I remembered and counted that day. When lazuli buntings burst in a blue cloud above my open sky cage, I remembered and blessed their day. When saffron finches dust-bathed in the detention yard, I dreamt of home that day. When I heard rapid fire of woodpeckers in the pines below Camp Echo, I remembered and trembled that day. When I saw scarlet tanagers swoop across the Gulf of Guantanamo, I fled with them that day. When the oriole bowed his orange cowl from the watchtower, I remembered and feared that day. When Stygian owls plied their sorrow flutes in reeds beyond the kill zone, I remembered and wept that day. When a mourning dove swayed on her roost of razor wire above Camp Echo, I buried my heart that day. I wake to macaws squawking, Tofik, the echo of guards bawling, Bahani. My heart is folded in your wing. Remember me this way. The Romani community travellers, we don't get much of a look in contemporary society. Historically, that's been the case for hundreds of years. Occasionally, cases emerge in the press, usually misreported, often damning. It's hard to talk about this because it's a kind of racism which isn't even regarded as racism. Without going into any details, I have personally experienced racism in the most surprising ways and places. But because Roman identity, although proud, is also a deep form of vulnerability, then again, it's not something that's talked about. It's in Murnomos again. As you know, a lot of travellers and gypsies, Romanis are employed in fruit picking and on farms like the British Isles. Somewhat less so at the moment, and certainly less so as Brexit comes upon us. But they were, an essential part of our economy for years and years. This particular instance of this poem is set in Dale Farm. You might remember Dale Farm for its famous eviction, which took place in 2011 on the 19th of October. The eviction was carried out with minimal warning. Travellers had been living there for some time. First, the electricity was disconnected, and then more than 100 riot police appeared at 7 a.m. and entered the site through the rear entrance. 2 people were immediately tasered. The police removed the travellers from the 12-metre high scaffold tower on the front gate using what's called cherry pickers, which are mobile elevating work platforms. A kestrel spears sidelong on a thermal above the camp, clasping and unclenching the load bearings of his claws. Eyes harrow the grass with ultraviolet vision, runnels or trapdoors for voles and field mice, iridescent in the hovering kestrel's retina. Down the bird plummets. Sunlight strews her wands. The JCB tears down the caravan's door, slams down its prongs, shakes its claw. What's the load bearing for a pikey's caravan? These fruit pickers' bardos, they're built like bastard houses. Trying for weakness, the bailiff stabs a corner, twists prongs, tilts some caterpillar treads, grips and rips the roof from a traveller family, breakfasting together. As sunlight strews wands through the field and hedgerows, beyond their caravan's still opened windows. Outspill internal organs of a botched operation. The proudly folded teak dining table, a chandelier's glittering sprawl and glory, a cupboard loud with royal Dalton, the pot-belly stove still toasty from the morning. The cherry pickers lift their arms into the sun. Before the break for questions, and thanks for listening so far. The poem before that is called The Apostle Birds. I spent some time in Australia as part of my work as a poet and academic. I'm very honoured and to be able to do that. I built a lot of time into the time I'm over there for field work. At least I call it field work, but most of it's travelling great distances and watching birds. When I was 14 years old, I was doing the sciences at university because that's what I did. Sorry, the sciences when I was at school because that's what I did to be a scientist at university. It was very hard in my school to get involved in anything to do with arts because it was perceived as two cultures and the scientists wouldn't really be interested in anything to do with the arts. But as usual, there was an English teacher that came to the rescue. God bless teachers and those with vision. There was this one English teacher who encouraged me to go from Blackpool, where I lived, on a coach with all the English students to Stratford-on-Avon to see plays by William Shakespeare. And those moments are incredibly important in our lives, and they opened my eyes, they opened my ears, actually, to verse, to drama, to speech. But also I saw something else which alerted me too, which is when we went to see Shakespeare's Birthplace, I was really curious about this little bit of glass that was over part of the wall on the interior that showed the building of the house, what it was made out of, and it was made out of what's wattle and daub, made out of mud and straw. I found this absolutely fascinating. And in Australia, I'm very fond of these birds called apostle birds. And apostle birds are very gregarious, talkative creatures. They gang up with each other in between 6 and 20 birds, and they do everything together. They team build their nests, and they basically tell each other about it very loudly and proudly. This poem here, as you see, is in memory of the great Australian poet Les Murray. The poem was written very shortly after his death. The reason for the dedication is because Les has been a great influence upon me for so many years, but also he was one of the poets who encouraged me from in my early 20s, who took poems for his Australian magazine Quadrant and kind of stood up for the way I was writing, actually, particularly when I started writing using Romani. It's a very hard thing to do when people haven't done that before, to suddenly find somebody who got that, and Les got it and he understood it, and he published poems in Australia using Anglo-Romani. So this poem is for him. There's a change here. I've changed the word dew pond to an Australian word. You'll see it when I get to it. There are 12, no, there are 13 apostle birds, scribbling with their beaks, their gooey manures, nabbed from a billabong's edge, snaffling straws of sedge for the parched Australian bush, dabbing sun-dappled mush, testing and tasting and pasting the glues of a nest cup with their plastering, perimetering beak trowels. The whole gang goes up, blam, as one, and lands again as 3, bickering, jokily jostling over a job their selfless genes squawked sod's law at. The apostle birds go on scrappily, scrabbling and shaping the small world's whirl of muck and straw, of happy dung and all, in which their featherless, brawling Shakespeares will gape and call. Thank you very much. And now we shall spend some time around the fire talking with you, and we've received some questions before this reading, and also I hope there are questions from the chat, and feel free to join the chat and answer questions which are responsible and which I can help with, but otherwise anything you like. Thank you, Yvonne.
Wonderful, wonderful reading. Thank you so much, David. It's funny, isn't it? We're all in our homes or wherever, and we feel a bit as though we're around the campfire, don't we? It's a lovely way of being able to share poetry. Just mesmerising reading. Magical. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yvonne. The campfire analogy, I think, I found it very useful over the past 6 months. The campfires of our screens being gathered around this in Zoom's meetings and Teams meetings, the little fire and the glow of people's houses in the backgrounds, but just that screen being able to connect you with people, and also the quietness around that screen too, being like that around a campfire too. The pause of traffic, the pause of industry, the pause of footfall, the increased noise of birds, of wildlife. I found it, kind of mesmerizing at times, actually, the silence and the screen.
I suppose that silence and the effect of lockdown leads me into my first question for you, David. I'm interested in the Lye Bird Sequence. In fact, I read it all the way through the moment I got my hands on my copy. So it's kind of stitched through the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you composed it?
I shall do so without trying to get carried away, which is what happened when I was writing it. I found it, I've written pontoons before. As I say, it's a Malayan form in which lines repeat in a particular order. And I just came up with this strange ambition that I wanted to write, test myself actually, to write at length, see how far I could take that form of verbal music and keep it going. And, you know, on such strange self-games are built poems that become inevitable, that write themselves. Anyway, this ended up being a 100-line pontoon in the end. I actually do have a copy of it here because I couldn't do it on the screen. I had to stitch it together with sellotape and put it over my kitchen table and move it. And, you know, if somebody opened the door and there was a puff of wind, these little lines would get blown all over the place, and I've stitched the whole thing together. It goes on, by the way, so I'll put it to one side. It's like a sculpture of language. But the repeated line of a pontoon is very interesting, but I want to alter that because actually it's a narrative and it's addressed to somebody. So rather than repeating the lines, I repurposed them. I changed lots of things about each of the lines. I changed whole nouns, verbs, the tense even, so that although you'd hear a certain amount of repetition, what you hear is a kind of the echo of the vision of that line and the sound of it. That repurposing of the line was the key to it. It was a kind of half rhyme of the meaning of the line. So anyway, there were 100 of these. And I left them in that form. And then I suddenly realized that actually what I'd written is what's called a half coroner, because if you broke those lines into 14ers, let's call them sonnets, 7 sonnets dropped out quite straightforwardly. And when I looked at them, I realized that in fact the rhyme scheme was all naturally quite already there. And actually they work quite separately. The book Fury has a number of dramatic monologues in it, which by some contemporary standards, but not Robert Browning's, are long. I mean, you know, 3 pages or 4 pages long. And I felt that as I was feeling the book through, actually during the early part of lockdown, in fact, I needed to put air into the kind of symphony. I had to put little bits of air into it, little stopping places, as the gypsies might say, where you could actually take a breath, reflect, and perhaps, and then move on. And that these poems provided those little stopping places within it, rather than some kind of full-on, you know, piece of music. So that's how they landed there. And, you know, there's a certain amount of enjoyment in making a big sculpture of words and then knocking it all over and rebuilding it. But it forced me to be super inventive. And I have to say I really enjoyed playing with the plasticine of these words over and over and over again and trying to get them to kind of move. It took me a long time and a lot of sellotape. And hey, if you made one error in that line order, the whole thing had to be done again and again and again until it was mathematically fed itself out. But it's just like writing a piece of music, really, but there's a kind of certain guiding principle behind it. I hope they work. They're quite new to me, actually.
Yeah, I love them. And I also love the characters in this book. You mentioned the dramatic monologues. So these Romani characters, Titan, Fury, Wisdom Smith, and of course the Roma matriarch are the kind of human heart of the collection. How do you find your characters and research them, David?
I keep a lot of notebooks about my accounts and encounters. I'm quite frank about this. I'm very fond of my characters, and you know, I kind of form relationships with them, which are quite real to me. Some are real, some are imagined, some are a combination of the two. I don't want to take people's words and kind of make them my own. I don't like that appropriation. I like to kind of give homage and debt to what is said. I have shared my work with travellers before. And it's been, you know, humbling and really enlightening experience as well. With Tyson Fury, there was, you know, I wasn't going to interview him myself, but But his interviews are out there and they're very fascinating. One of the things I was getting with Tyson, he's a Romani boxer who's really struggled with a lot of issues, racism being one of them. As he says it, nobody likes to see a Romani doing well. But within his field, he's a standing magician of what he does. But he's his own worst enemy, and he knows that. And his enemy within the ring, when he's fighting, is himself. And he has said things which, you know, people find unforgivable. But what's interesting about him too is that he would not forgive himself for saying those things. He suffers from bipolar disorder, and in times of mania, and then in times of huge depression, he does reflect upon what he's said and done, and often gets to the point of great blackness. I mean, this poem doesn't describe it. It actually takes his own words, where he's come close to murdering himself, given how he thinks about himself. And this is a man who has been, if you like, at times on top of the world when it comes to what he's done. I say he's aware that his enemy is himself, and that's what that poem's getting into. That character. That's what I found very interesting about that. That's what I found interesting with my characters is how that enemy inside yourself, that kind of psychological hurt, the environment, is something that I'm very curious about. There are obviously personal reasons for that, which I won't go into here because it's less about me and more about characters. But I always like that sense of the drama that you can't quite escape because it's inside the destiny that you work with inside yourself and sometimes try to change and sometimes can't escape from. And so there are lots of characters in this. I'm very fond of them. I love them, and I try to vivify them in language and in drama. That's what they are. They're dramatic monologues. I hope people like them, and you know, I think they're characters who kind of come alive in language and kind of deserve a voice. That's the thing, they deserve a voice and are often not given one or are invisible.
And other characters and presences in this book are poets. So can you tell us a bit more about how they have helped to shape your work?
Yeah, I think this is a book of debts to those characters, but some of those characters are other writers and artists, and I was pretty free with that. These debts are honestly granted to me over many years. If you read the book through, you'll see that I think all the debts bar one are women writers and artists. Women writers and artists have been important to me right from the beginning of when I started getting into poetry, from that first English teacher, actually, to the school librarian at my sixth form. She was the person who took me seriously as a poet. It was her, Anne Ashworth, who got me off doing games on a Wednesday and pushed me to read poets, including poets like Tsvetaeva and Akhmatova, who I found incredibly exciting. I didn't know they were not contemporary British poets. For me, they were poets, and I took them at their word. Later on, poets like Marianne Moore, Elizabeth Bishop in particular, the way she writes about the natural world, absolutely. Poets such as Emily Dickinson, I find it, intensely exciting, not just for the language, but also her knowledge of the natural world. You might not, I don't know if people know, she was a really gifted gardener. She has this herbarium that she kept throughout her life of wildflowers. Her knowledge of the natural world was almost close to being that of a gifted natural scientist. But anyway, those are, I think, 5 examples of women writers. There are a lot more that are mentioned in the book, with kind of the debt kind of exemplified in the kind of language that I'm using to honour and bring them back. They would include also Charlotte Bronte and also Jane Austen, who I was very surprised people learn. I was very influenced by, when I was a young writer, by her amazing ability to ventriloquize character and to never undernotice the details of what people say and what they don't say.
So this is a book that helps us to be alert to voices in the natural world, but it's also a book of Myrnanos and silence. I'm curious about the dual language way you're composing your poems, David. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure, but I'll keep it as brief as I can. Again, I have to be careful about following my enthusiasms with this, getting carried away. I said that Anglo-Romani is specific to times and places. Romani is not per se a language, it's a series of dialects. It's not recognized as a language in this country, the United Kingdom. It's not regarded as an official language. We tried to get it recognized by the Cameron government and it was turned down. When I attempted to go to the Bodleian Library as a young academic, I asked to take the language in Romani and was summarily dismissed because that was a one language they did not have, having promised that they had all the languages of the world available to take that vow. You know, I was partly encouraged to burn their books as a result of that, but instead what I did was, rather than take that particular outrageous mission to mind, I translated it myself into Romani. Romani is macaronic. It adopts languages as it moves through them. In that way, it's actually very much like English. Actually, in that way, that English is voracious of other tongues and makes them its own. Romani adopts other tongues as it moves through them, and therefore the different dialects of Romani are different countries. The macronic nature for it I find fascinating, but also the other thing I really find fascinating about Romani is its doubleness, because one phrase can sometimes mean, if you know Romani, it can mean more than one thing. It can sometimes mean 3 or 4 things actually. It's depending upon context, and when you bring Romani into play within a poem or within drama, all those different meanings are in place simultaneously. This obviously means that I have to put generous amounts of kind of footnotes in the poems to cue people in. But you know, I'll give you an example. There's a phrase called "Sorry, semensa semen," a very short, beautiful phrase, and it means we are all one. We are all one. All who are with us are ourselves, which, you know, could sound beguiling and beautiful. But it's double-edged. Yes, sure, all who are with us are ourselves. And, you know, along that sword of that phrase is the other meaning of that, which is that, you know, if you're not, then there are other intentions within that phrase, which you bring into play within speech and also within writing. It's the spoken form of it, which I find beguiling too. Poetry is spoken word, always has been for me. And, you know, traveller speech is largely, well, obviously spoken. Obviously, I do have a lot of dictionaries, which I've delved into. I got into writing it when I was about 30 years old. I had to give myself permission to do so. I was very influenced by the Welsh poet R.S. Thomas, who never got around to writing in Welsh until he was 30 years old, and then strove to learn the language and then to use it. He never actually got around to writing many poems in Welsh, although he did write a biography called Neb in Welsh. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting example to actually give yourself permission later on to do this, to let these words inhabit your poetry. And what I found is that they came very naturally to me.
So I have a question from Anthony Lawrence in Australia. How has Les Murray's translations from the natural world been influential for you? I've named that book as one of the 3 most influential books upon me, along with Elizabeth Bishop's Geography 3 and Richard Adams's Watership Down, which certainly
certainly was my way into literature when I was about 11 years old. But yeah, Translation for That was a terrific book of astonishing negative capability by Les. And he really is a kind of supersonic in not just in language, and it's what he calls the painless headache of composition, but his ability to throw himself into species and into things shows us what Keats calls negative capability of such astonishing persuasiveness. And it just feels ultra natural, already a part of our speech and a part of the speech about the creatures he's inhabiting. It never feels anthropomorphic. It feels, almost, entirely natural. A huge influence in massively important ways as an enabler. And he's a true poet. I think Les Murray is probably one of the most important poets of the 20th century, and we all miss him.
Well, on the subject of the natural world, I have a climate change question for you from Horatio Morpurgo. He asks, what role and what audience is there for climate change poetry?
That's a very good question, and one. Let me briefly just say that I was alert to environmental horrors when I was a teenager. I was aware of global warming in the 80s and 70s. It was already upon us then. And as a young scientist, I was advised to go into that field because it was coming upon us so fast. But the current threat was acid rain. And as somebody who was environmentally alert, although I did join what was then the Green Party, and I did campaign on those issues, I felt I was of better use if I was actually an environmental investigator. And that's what I did when I did my research projects in acid rain for 3 years, exploring the Lake District and looking at acidity and its impact upon insects, actually, who are at the bottom of the food chain for those particular systems. I felt that was kind of environmentalism in action. I wrote poems throughout the particular period. There's a poem in Fury that tries to balance those two things together: the scientific language of the ways that we perceive the natural world, but also the ways that we psychologically see the natural world at the same time, which is utterly personal. It's quite an open poem when it comes to emotion and psychology. I just want to say one thing about this. It's very difficult for poetry to stand on its own and change government policy or industrial policy when it comes to environmental damage. I do think, however, that one of the things that's not often talked about with environmental destruction is the way that we are damaging the environment in our minds. That's happening simultaneously. To us as a species on this planet, our psychology is being altered by this. The environment, not just of our minds, but the way that affects our physiology is being altered too by this fear, this guilt as well. That environmental destruction takes place, I think, in everybody. We all know this is going on inside ourselves. What can poetry do? Poetry is a way of talking, speaking with one another, speaking to one another as best we can. If that gives solace, if that allows people to express themselves in a way that feels more clear and honest in language, maybe that's a way to help that environmental damage to our minds, our souls. That might affect us physiology. That might help us as a society and as a species.
Yeah, so I'll relay one more question and then I think we have a final poem.
Sure.
Steve Eli is saying, is it a paradox about Romani people that they are othered from Englishness by many and yet they have a deep knowledge of the land?
Yeah, that's a great question, but it's also a great point to have made, and one I utterly agree with. Again, I can't unpack that because it would be it's one of the poets I've written about a lot, in particular in a book called The Gypsy and the Poet, is John Clare. John Clare, the great kind of naturalist poet. He would share that with Emily Dickinson, actually, his ability to be a hugely interesting natural scientist in the world, as well as being a poet. John Clare is very interesting to me because his best friends were gypsies, particularly a gypsy called Wisdom Smith, who appears in this book. And it was one of the things that attracted Clare to gypsies was indeed that very point that's being made there, is that they had this amazingly embedded and necessary knowledge of the natural world. It's necessary for, well, survival to know that world. And I imagine that went for labouring classes in that time too, as Clare was, where you had to know about the natural world to survive within it. Those are aspects of kind of Englishness, which I'm quite interested in, how far we've got away from that, how we can affirm ourselves with that knowledge again. It's not that hard, I think, to do that. Anyway, I hope I've answered those questions as best I can. I wish I had more time to kind of think about them and answer them, if you like, with less off the cuffness.
Well, wonderful. And we do actually have the questions that the audience members have written in. There are a few we don't have time for now, but David has told me that he'll be all right with having them sent to him, so he can hopefully take a look. Wonderful to hear about the writing process. That was absolutely fascinating, and we got to see a typescript with all the annotations. It's just fabulous. Thank you so much, David. That was really, really inspirational. And I need to hand over to you now so that you can read us a final poem.
Thank you. Well, thank you to Yvonne and to Jasmine and Carcanet for setting this up. But also, thank you to all of you. I see the number of participants here. We went to over 100. Thank you for coming into my home. It was nice to have you in more than groups of 6, to have 100 here. Around this fire of mine. And so we'll finish off with this poem. This is the last of the lyre birds. 7th lyre bird. My vow glints with deer hooves, daring beyond a tree line. My vow ambles like an anteater between turrets of termites. My vow slinks with a dog fox behind the prince and prince of rabbits. My vow blinks from fields' flints among frozen tares. Your vow trips a honey badger with motion capture cameras. Your vow trepans tectonics from a mountain's memory. Your vow is Raymond Carver posting the word hummingbird in a letter. Your vow traces bloody paw tracks to where? This grizzling bear. My vow grasps a glacier's crevasse and verglass. My vow climbs Amazonian trees on a Hoatzin's dinosaur winged fingers. My vow is Tess Gallagher, holding the hummingbird of summer. Our vow sings the names we share with our children. Our vow clutches the Hoatzin's hapless fledglings in an Amazonian river. Our vow is the lyre bird's thesaurus of memory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It was really wonderful to hear you read from this book. It was a really moving reading. I'm sure everyone agrees. There's been some amazing responses in the chat that you'll be able to look at a later date. But yeah, thank you, and thank you, Yvonne, for having that discussion with David. It was really fabulous to hear you talk about some of those things, and it was great to see that typescript, as you mentioned, Yvonne. I am going to put the link and the code for you to buy your copy of the book in the chat. It's there for you now. As I said before, don't worry if you can't do it all now. It's all going quite quickly. So check your emails tomorrow. You'll get a link and you'll get the code in your email. But do feel free to get in touch with me if there's any problems with that. We're always here. So finally, please do try to join us this time next week. On Wednesday, the 16th of September, we're launching Jory Graham's new collection, Runaway, with Isabel Gallimore. So that's our next launch. We have a few launches coming up and they're all listed on the website, so please do check them out and come to any that you can make it to. Okay, I think that's enough from us. Congratulations, David, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful reading, and thank you again to Yvonne. I'm going to go now, and I'm just going to give you guys a couple of seconds to log out and send any last minute messages in the chat. So thank you and good night.